Super Mario World has a very special place in my childhood. When I tell you I was obsessed, that would be an understatement. I just could not get enough of the ROM Hacktask videos from the early 2010s, like the Pit of Death, Pit of Despair, Kaizo Mario, and basically everything else that was popular back then. But anyway, in this video I'll be going over various collections of things that were either unused or removed in Super Mario World. Doing my initial research on this one made me realize that there really is so much content that never made it into the game, and I think you might be surprised at some of the early concepts for the game that were ultimately replaced by something else. This game has unused areas, code, enemies, objects, graphics, items, sounds, and so many other things that I know that most of you guys will find interesting. Also, there's just no way that I can cover literally everything because of the inevitability of new discoveries and leaks that uncover even more things about this game than the massive amount of things we already have. Honestly, I don't really have anything else to say in the intro, so let's just get on with it. For the beginnings, let's start with some general stuff. Super Mario World contains two different translucent level modes, with one for horizontal layer 1 background levels and another for horizontal layer 1 and 2. Both of the modes are fully functional, and their positions at the end of the mode list most likely meant that they were shoved into the code somewhat later into the game's development, and the levels that utilize the transparency look like this. For some reason at the very end of Donut Plains 2, there's a single Buzzy Beetle that is stuck inside of a wall. Even weirder is that this does not exist in the Game Boy Advance remake, and because the screen slowly auto-scrolls, it is impossible to be seen without using a level editor. And even if you could see it, the beetle would just fall through the floor and die anyway. There's a pipe in Vanilla Secret 1 that leads to this secret exit. There's warp data that takes the player to the same exit, and this was done to fix a bug with the secret exit pipe. If Mario enters the pipe while riding Yoshi, he'll be just barely high enough, by a single pixel by the way, to be on the next screen up instead of the correct one. So instead of just moving the pipe down a block, they instead decided to duplicate the data for it, and that's where we get this. For some weird reason, there's another instance of the red switch map tile that's coded into Valley of Bowser. There's no way to reach it or activate it without hacking the game, and trying to enter this level leads to level 112, which points to the test stage. The actual level ID of the Red Switch Palace is 11B, but it doesn't actually take you there for reasons I could only imagine. Valley of Bowser 3 has its enable path on secret exit value set to left, whereas all other single exit levels have it set to up, implying that there was a path there at some point, but Nintendo probably figured that the player would have little need for red switch blocks by the time they reached a Valley of Bowser, and so they moved it to Vanilla Dome 2 instead. So the door on the left is how the boss door normally appears in the game. But this door on the right represents how the different 8x8 tiles stored in the VRAM comprise the boss door. Each color is a different 8x8 tile. What's weird about this though is that the graphics for the orange, purple, and green tiles are all identical, but are stored as being separate tiles. This could imply that the door once had a much different appearance, and that the purple and green tiles could have been originally used for something else, like doorknobs or hinges, but again, it's impossible to know. There are some blank tiles in the overworld graphics banks which appear to be drawn over the pathways that Mario actually takes. Turns out that these tiles were once used by the developers to indicate where the unrevealed pathways were, and it's actually possible to enable this patch by downloading this IPS file from the cutting room floor. At some point in time during the game's development, it was actually possible to save a Starman in the reserve item box, though exactly how you would get it there is still a mystery. There's even a routine that specifically checks for the Starman item ID, which is 03, and cycles the colors appropriately, but it seems like Nintendo didn't implement the palette values properly, since the values that they did input shifts each color value left by 1 bit. Changing the values to these numbers will fix it. Have you ever wondered what the bottom of the goalpost looks like? Of course you have. Though they're never actually seen in-game, the goalposts actually do have a bottom tile. It's likely that they were intended to float above the ground at some point, and the rounded part of the large one was overridden at some point in development, and the only reason we even have this is because of the massive Nintendo Giga Leak that happened in 2020. Normally, the game's bonus table caps at 1-ups after stomping 8 enemies in a row, but due to a programming oversight, this specifically doesn't apply to the Wigglers. Starting from the 10th stomp, you'll receive a 2-up, 3-up, 5-up, 5 coins, 10 coins, 15 coins, 20 coins, and finally 25 coins. After 25 coins, Each stomp will overflow the bonus table and give a glitched bonus, which is usually a very large number of points and coins. Also, none of these unused bonuses appear right. The 5-up pulls its attributes from the code following the bonus sprite table, while the coin bonus graphics just don't exist. The only way to see them is in the SNES test program, which is what is being shown on screen. By extracting the graphics files from the Special World's changed enemies, the sheet contains an unmodified duplicate of the Galumba graphics, and they're actually used by the game when the Special World has been cleared. It's possible that, at one point, clearing the Special World would have made these enemies change appearance drastically, just like they did in the Game Boy Advance remake, but they don't have similar sprites for the falling through parachutes graphics though, so using non-identical graphics would cause both of the designs to clash. Time to talk about developer tools. Just like with Super Mario 64, there's also developer tools for this game as well. I couldn't find any footage of this, nor do I have a Game Genie or an SNES, so instead I'm going to briefly explain them and move on. This Game Genie code enables a free movement in instant flight. Hold L and press A once and you'll be able to fly. Hold L and press A again and you'll be able to move Mario anywhere in the stage. Hold Y to speed up and press L and A again to return to normal. This code enables a power-up select mode. Holding up and pressing select switches between small, big, cape, and fire Mario. Also worth noting that this was removed in the European version for some reason. This code will let you choose what kind of Yoshi you want to have on the map. Press select to cycle through the different Yoshi colors: none, yellow, blue, red, and green. Though I don't know what none would be. These codes allow you to instantly complete any level, even ones that you haven't already beaten. Pressing start and then select completes the level via the normal route, and if you hold A and B while pressing select to complete the level, it completes it with the secret goal if it has it. This code allows you to reach Star World from Yoshi's house. Pressing select while on Yoshi's house teleports you straight to Star World 1. And finally, these codes allow you to walk on not yet revealed paths and enter not yet revealed levels, but you're not allowed to go through locked doors. Super Mario World has quite a lot of invisible 1-up triggers. These triggers involve Mario touching 4 invisible points on a level in the correct order, and doing so will spawn a 1-up. The only way to find these are to come across them by chance, and some of them are far more obscure than others, so let's go through them all. Donut Plains 4, Cookie Mountain, Donut Plains 1, Number 6 Wendy's Castle, Chocolate Island 2, Vanilla Fortress, Number 2 Morton's Castle, Yoshi's Island 4, Vanilla Ghost House, Number 7 Larry's Castle, Vanilla Dome 4, Forest of Illusion 3, Gnarly, Valley of Bowser 2, and finally, the test map. So it's pretty common knowledge that if you stare down a boo for around 8 seconds, it'll briefly make a face at you. But something less widely known is that big boos also have a similar thing. The difference with them though is that instead of waiting 8 seconds, you have to wait 16 seconds. Alright, so now it's time to move on to the development stages. So before I get started with this, I want to preface this section by saying that there is a lot in a straight line that, if not talked about in a certain way, would be potentially boring to 95% of the viewers. So what I'm going to do is talk about the sprites in chunks by increments of around 3 or so, unless the standalone sprite is interesting enough in itself. You'll see. Starting with textures from October 1989, some of the oldest sprites made for the game are early animations of Morton, Roy, and Ludwig, animations of the Koopalings, and an early animation of Mario riding a cloud. Morton and Roy don't actually breathe fire in the final game like these animations might suggest, but the graphics do still exist within the ROM. Same thing goes for the Koopalings. I'm gonna guess that for the Mario Cloud, it could have been used to skip levels like the cloud in Super Mario Bros. 3, but it's hard to say. Next we have an unknown 1-tile-sized green creature climbing up a block, so let me know in the comments what his name should be. Next we have an older charge and chuck animation, originally having a graphic for being hit from the side, a dazed looking Chuck with sparkles around him, most likely for whenever the player would jump on him, and the clapping animation might look normal, but this one has smaller hands than in the final. Next we have a Chuck throwing a beach Koopa, which if I were to guess may have been some kind of unique attack that they would have performed when coming in contact in a stage, and we also have a turning animation. So next up we have some cannons. The first animation is a narrow tube that shoots out Koopa shells. No idea where that would have went. Looks like it belongs in an airship from Mario 3 if you ask me. We also have a small walking cannon, which along with the wind-up key, later ended up being used in Yoshi's Island 2 as an enemy called the Kaboomba. And the Kaboomba also seemed to have been planned to be expanded upon with a larger variant that shot shells, something that would also later be implemented into another Mario game, being Super Mario Maker. These two sprite sheets are an early set of designs for Mario and Raccoon Mario, with the differences in the first one being that Mario has a slightly smaller hat, and the interesting thing about the raccoon textures is that not only is it directly a concept from Mario 3, but it was later replaced by what would ultimately become the cape. It's really hard to imagine this game without the cape, by the way. According to the file name for this one, these are animations that were made for an object called the Naval Mine. They seem to be attached to an early version of the midpoint, but this could also be a placeholder or just another case of overwritten graphics. This is kind of similar to the water mine that was cut from Super Mario 64 that I talked about in my other video, but it's hard to say for certain. This next set of animations are pretty weirdly separated, so I'm going to quickly go through them all instead of dragging this on. So firstly, we have an animation of Mario flying without a cape, for some reason. Next we have some of Mario flying but with the raccoon suit instead of the cape, one where he jolts forward then goes back up again, and then another where he does a full-on flip, and this is probably where you thought that I'd be done talking about the cape power-up, but we've actually got 3 more early concepts for it. Interestingly, for reasons that I don't really know, the original cape texture had Mario wearing a purple helmet for some reason, with these animations being basically identical to the final ones that ended up being used. And after the helmet idea was scrapped, another potential replacement would have been Mario wearing wings, which is honestly a pretty safe option and it still does look pretty good, albeit less iconic than the cape. And the last two I'll talk about here is a version of the original cape with the helmet removed, which also looks pretty good on its own as well, but this is where it gets weird. This is the last and final rendition of the cape costume before it was finalized, and this version features a smaller cape, and most obviously also features Mario with a green and red outfit instead of his signature red, blue, and white, and I don't know why, it's really weird. Now these next ones are some of my favorites. Several completely unused Bowser cars, which were probably early concepts of the Koopa Clown car, were created at some point in April of 1990, and these are the 4 unused designs. This is by far the most interesting thing so far, at least in my opinion, and my personal favorite in order is the second one, first one, fourth one, and then the third one. But which one is your favorite? Let me know in the comments. Also, I'm just now realizing this while I'm editing the video right now, but some of the frames on the first one are just gone. Like, I don't know why, they're just gone. This animation, created in June of 1990, seems to most likely be a very early version of the Blarg. The animation implies that this enemy would have had its dorsal fin sticking out rather than eyes peeking out of lava like we have now. I guess there was originally going to be an animation of Bowser turning in the Koopa Clown car, because the final game doesn't have this turning frame. The propeller is also replaced with a wind-up key, and there's also a crouching Bowser looking around without the car. Now this one is easily my favorite entity sprite so far. This cut elderly Yoshi with animations for walking and talking was unfortunately cut out of the game for whatever reasons Nintendo had to remove it. Based on the file name being called Dorgon House Demo, with Dragon House being the original name for Yoshi's house, it definitely would have been used in Yoshi's house, probably as an NPC if I were to guess. Someone should make a ROM that adds the elderly Yoshi back in the game, because I would play it. The last 2 things in this section feature one slightly interesting thing, and one really interesting thing. The snake block originally had graphics for large blocks on each end, instead of all being on the same block, but that's not the interesting one. Animations of Mario during the castle destruction cutscene used to feature Mario traveling in and out of the background. This is really interesting to me, especially because I can't help but not think about the mini mushroom power-up from New Super Mario Bros. Wii when I look at this. I mean, come on, it's so identical. Alright, time to move on to even more unused textures. With all these graphics being found inside of a file called chr-stock, this first bit consists of various animations of Mario riding an early version of Yoshi. It's also more evident that Mario is hitting Yoshi in the head in the animation where he breathes fire. Next we have this unknown creature dancing on a row of brick blocks, shaking it in the process. This is yet another very ambiguous animation that we can only assume what it is or how it might have worked in the game. My theory is that it probably would have hid inside of the blocks and would only appear when Mario gets close to it. Going back to the Yoshi animations, this animation of Yoshi eating a yellow shell is completely by itself, and for some reason isn't connected to the other sheet that I showed a minute ago, but still. The early version of the Wiggler originally was green and had what looks like a party hat, but the hat was eventually replaced with a flower and the color was changed to yellow. So this animation has no real correlation to anything else in the game that I can find, and it's just a nameless bird flying around that ended up going unused. I'm getting large Klepto vibes, you know, the bird from Mario 64, but I have no idea. So if anybody has any good name suggestions for when I inevitably adopt this bird as a pet, I'd love to hear what people would name it. Oh, also, right underneath this is unused animated water, and it kind of makes it look like the bird is flying over it. Also, there's an animation of Mario swimming with a different hat for some reason. The parachuting Galumba originally had a snappier looking animation compared to the final one, and honestly I think that the final one looks worse than the early one, honestly. Next we have yet another isolated Yoshi one, but this one is specifically of a baby Yoshi eating what seems to be some kind of blue parabeetle, with both the animation and whatever Yoshi is eating not making it into the final game. I really want to eat whatever that blue thing is for some reason. Early versions of the sea urchins included numbered animation frames marked in the corners, while also being different iterations of the actual enemy themselves. But before there were urchins that looked like that, this one was a very early version which more closely resembled a real sea urchin. I really like this guy. Alright, so we're done with section 2, now it's time to move on to the third. So starting off section 3, we have very early versions of Mario and Luigi, the latter of which originally had unique graphics instead of being a palette swap of Mario. The sheet also features some Koopas, a Lakitu with a square cloud, and whatever that spiky enemy is called, I can never remember what his name is. Also, just get a really good look at this sheet because it's really interesting seeing what Mario and Luigi could have looked like had Nintendo just used this one instead. These next 4 sheets are all separate, but to save a little bit of time, it makes more sense to talk about them all at the same time instead, so that's what I'm going to do. This first one is a row of early Mario sprites, with the difference being Mario's hat. The next one is a sheet of Mario shrinking, which was meant for the explosion scene that I mentioned earlier. Next is a sprite of Mario standing up straight, with one of them missing a hat, most likely intended to be used for the cutscene after Bowser's defeat. And finally, a scratchpad of sprite data for Luigi's distinct graphics that were implemented in Super Mario All-Stars. Also, this sheet is interesting. Wait, is Luigi Okay. Moving on. So this next group of stuff consists of an early version of the fireballs thrown by Fire Mario, early Koopa Troopas that were much more reminiscent of their Super Mario Bros. 3 appearance, a sheet of the Koopa shells with their shading changing over time, climbing Koopa sprites that originally had different shading and were later given shoes, and 4 different variations of the Beach Koopas, with the differences being in the walking animation, the squashed sprite being changed from 16x16 to an 8x8 sprite that's flipped horizontally to create the other half, and the original sheet from 1989 having a biting animation, with its purpose not being known. I guess it would bite you, I don't know. Here we have an early version of the wings worn by the Paratroopas and Paragoombas that were originally red and were slightly smaller, and this can actually be seen in some very early screenshots of the game. Sprites of classic Goombas are present in previous sprite sheets, but were later replaced with a new design that is also called a Goomba on the English localizations, but then was relocalized as Galoombas in later games, because Nintendo felt like doing that. The sprites are reminiscent of their appearance in Super Mario Bros. 3 and are the same ones used by the Paragoombas in even more early screenshots of the game. And next we have to talk about this. This unknown creature was created in July of 1989, and my best guess here is that it was probably a 16-bit rendition of the Micro Goomba from Super Mario Bros. 3, and then just was not used in the game. And while we're at it, this is another unknown creature, which later shows up in a game called Super Mario Bros. Wonder as an enemy called the Koopalings, who seems to, I think, resemble a flower in its original concept. But just like with some of the other unnamed things so far, I don't know. So moving on. Grouping the next 4 together, the stem of the jumping piranha plant originally had less shading, a minor change in the perspective of Lakitu's head was changed, with the final tiles also including Lakitu throwing something. The Cheep Cheeps were originally more in line with their classic appearance before being changed to what they are now, and the classic Hammer Bros can be seen in an early version of the Forest Enemy graphics set. Early versions of the Dino Rhino looked like this, and were viewed in a profile view instead of being a 3/4 view, and there's also a smaller variant of the unused rhinos as well. Another interesting one is the Banzai Bill. The finished version of the Banzai Bill is iconic, and it's hard to think of it looking any different than it does now, but the original version of it made in July of 1990 was gray, and was far more dull looking than the final. Okay, wait, let's stop for a second. What is that? It says that it's an early blob-shaped baby Yoshi that lacks any limbs, and I don't know what to say about this, it's just funny to me. Okay, but anyway, on to coins. The second two coins were originally 16 by 16 sprites, which were later changed to 8 by 8 sprites that are flipped vertically to create the bottom half. The first coin also has slightly different shading. The Dragon coin went through a number of revisions until Nintendo finally settled on a coin with Yoshi's face. They started with a generic large coin, then turned it into a coin with a 10 on it, then a 5 with a magenta color for some reason, then had Mario's face on it with a slightly different shape, and then finally, the coin with Yoshi's face. The Smiley coin, before it had a smiley on it, originally had a star design. A similar design would later be used in Super Mario 64, and I'm glad that they went with a unique design because I think it makes Mario World stand out even more than it already does. You guys ready for more run-ons? Alright, let's go. The Super Mushrooms had extra shading added to its final variant. The Fire Flower was completely redesigned late into development, mainly to stray further away from the style of Super Mario Bros. 3. The Super Leaf, also from Super Mario Bros. 3, that would have granted the player the raccoon form would ultimately be replaced by the Cape ability, and it went through 4 different redesigns before being settled on the Leaf sprite. The question mark block was redesigned to have better shading and a less rigid design. The brick block from previous Mario games would be replaced by the rotating block. Same goes with the empty blocks, the note blocks, the wood block, and the gray block. The rubble that appears after breaking a block was changed many times. The third variant of this is also present in the SNES test. An early version of the bonus block originally had a picture of a 1-up on it, but was later changed to be fully green with a white star. And lastly, the triangular block originally had a mechanical appearance to it, which can be seen in pre-release pictures of the game. It would be redesigned a year later to have eyes, was eventually changed to be a hot pink color, and then was finally given a smiley. The early P-switch design has a very interesting color to it. It's hard to imagine the P-switch being anything but the shade of lighter blue that everybody knows it as. Also, the unused on and off switches at one point were red for on and green for off. The assumption here is that the switches might have functioned like the on and off blocks in the final game, but it's hard to say that too. Alright, well now it's time to move on to general stage pieces. So starting with pipes. The pipes originally had sharper edges and simpler shading, with the earliest version of them being seen in early screenshots of the game. The finalized version has rounded edges with more complex shading than the original. The spinning platform used to be taller, which resembled the way that they looked in Super Mario Bros. 3, and it also had a slightly different highlight on the top. Nintendo changed this to be thinner, which they also ended up doing with the checkerboard platform, and while I'm at it, this unknown platform also exists in the stage pieces and was scrapped from the final game. It bears a resemblance to donut blocks from games like Super Mario Bros. 3, and it probably would have made an appearance as a counterpart to the donut blocks. The door, key, and even the keyhole weren't always finalized. The door used to have an extremely minor change in shading. The early version of the key had its peg on the top instead of the bottom, and the original keyhole was much larger and lacked a white outline. The white outline was most likely added so that it could be more visible in darker backgrounds, because obviously. Even the goal tapes weren't finalized. Being visible in early screenshots, the goal tapes were originally blue shifted and had a more icy blue color, and the pole on the smaller checkpoint was also much thinner than in the final version. The larger one isn't much different, with the original version also looking much more frozen. Also, the gold tape was originally flat, but was later changed to have rounded edges, much like with a lot of the textures I've already talked about. The top of the Bill Blaster was originally made up of 4 unique tiles, rather than 2 tiles that are flipped horizontally to create the right half. A later version of this does still exist in the final game, but goes unused as shown on the right. This sign outside of Yoshi's house originally read Dragon rather than saying Yoshi in Japanese, which might suggest that it was once going to be called the Dragon House instead of the Yoshi House. This blanket-like object is by itself in the files, and I think mostly resembles a pillow or a blanket, and because it's grouped with other stage intro graphics, it might have had a baby Yoshi resting on top of it. And now that I said that, I know everyone is going to want to see a baby Yoshi on it, so here you go. Alright, let's move on to Peach. Peach's early sprites originally had less shading, a slightly different tiara, and larger eyes than in the final. And there's also sprites of Princess Peach screaming, and yeah. Well, thankfully that was redrawn and was later changed to these, with the differences of the last two being in her eyelashes and the shading. Last thing about Peach is that there's also a Peach scarecrow that resembles the puppet seen during the Lemmy and Wendy fights in the final game. This scrapped Koopaling portrait is unused and was most likely going to go in one of the ghost houses, and right underneath it there's a white sign that says 6, which I'm guessing was most likely intended for the world map. Alright, let's talk about tile sets now. This is an early version of the Plains tile set, with the most notable difference here being the white highlight on the grass, and one of the sheets having yellow grass instead of, well, green. This is an early version of the rope tile set. It's worth noting here that the mushroom platform had a more simpler design, which can be seen in early screenshots of the game. The early version of the underground tile set wasn't really changed all that much, but it is interesting that the original set was called Kanami, meaning wire mesh in English. And the last tile set, being the castle set, at some point had its slopes tiles overridden with the graphics for various different gimmicks. I hope you're ready for more entities. This is probably one of the earliest sprites of Mario, which is basically the same as the ones I showed earlier. This sheet is easily the most similar to Super Mario Bros. 3, and the raccoon power-up is clearly visible in the sheet. Along with Mario, there's also an early Koopa Troopa with a Beach Koopa standing upright, early sprites of Larry, an early Buzzy Beetle which would eventually show up in Paper Mario Sticker Star and New Super Mario Bros. U, and a small collection of sprites that have a very different style of shading compared to everything else. Not sure if this is a result of the artist just messing around, but who knows. These next two files are really interesting, and it looks like the artists were having quite a lot of fun. The sheet features Kawaso-kun, which is the river otter from a Japanese gag manga called Uchurundes, substituting as the playable character. The sheet predates the unrelated Famicom game made for Uchurundes by about a year and a half, and if you haven't noticed by now, this has various enemies that straight up aren't in the game. This edition was also found, with a comment in a file called zel_play.asm reading Metar Gauge Sub by Kawasu, which might mean that Kawasu in this context could just be a nickname for one of the devs. Like with Mario, this is probably the earliest version of Yoshi, which initially took on a very lanky and primitive appearance as opposed to what he looks like now. It's based on an early concept sketch that Shigeru Miyamoto drew during the development of Super Mario Bros. 3. Along with Yoshi, the remaining sprites consist of an unknown crocodile like Koopa, maybe intended to be a new dinosaur-themed subspecies of Koopas, a scratch pad of graphics for the bipedal Koopa Troopa, early Beach Koopas, including an early sprite of a Beach Koopa being ejected from its shell, a small Hammer Bro, which doesn't appear in the game at all, what appears to be a turning sprite for Spike Tops, similar to the one Koopas have, another early dinosaur-like iteration of Yoshi, early sprites of Red Hat Brim Mario riding Yoshi, with early versions of Balloon Mario too. This sprite sheet features things I've already talked about, except for this thing. Numerous sprites of Mario with a red hat brim again, including the fireball throwing frame, raccoon ear tiles, and a few early small Marios. Early versions of the Dry Bones, which are really similar to their Super Mario Bros. 3 counterpart. Early versions of the Galoomba. An early lava bubble with non-transparent eyes and different shading. Early versions of the Skull Raft. A few different iterations of the Pea Balloon. A big piranha plant, similar to the one seen in Mario Kart 64. And finally, this appears to be a scratch pad of the spheres that are attached to the spinning platform, but with a mushroom appearance instead. Did I say finally? I'm not done yet. Remember this guy? Well, he's back, and he's featured in another file, being this one. An early version of the animated candles seen in one of the castle backgrounds is here too, and in the final game, the flame and light use separate graphics with different animations, but the original ones were all in the same file. This pretty much confirms the thing that Baby Yoshi was eating earlier is a parabeetle, because these sprites for a parabeetle, an enemy from Super Mario Bros. 3, can also be found unused. The shimmering animation for the brick block and what seems to be an early version of the grab block, both of which resemble, guess what, their Super Mario Bros. 3 counterpart. The brick block would be replaced by the rotating block, with the grab block using the same graphics as the new rotating block, but with its respective color. Next is a scratch pad of what seems to be an early version of the fireball that Yoshi spits, early versions of Rip Van Fish, early dolphins, and a giant fish that resembles the boss bass from Mario 3, sprites of a Sledge Bro, which is another Mario 3 enemy that does not appear in Mario World. A sheet of early dolphins and some kind of shark is present in this one, with the sharks being obviously scrapped, but then later introduced in Super Mario Land 2. There's also a similarly designed character named Guppy. Sorry, not that one. There we go. Guppy would later appear in Super Mario Galaxy as well. Okay, I swear we're almost done, just hang in there. Animated tiles for the early question mark block and the brick block can be found, as well as some patches. Later renditions of the unused Venus fire trap and the upright piranha plant are here too. More early renditions of Yoshi with a rather large snout in this one. Slightly different sprites of Yoshi compared to the final, with the differences that I've noticed being in the scales on the back of its head. A collection of 3 files of early Mario looking up, crouching in 2 different ways, and Mario's head in a profile view. Right underneath this is also a gray wind key for something. A tiny Yoshi that's completely by itself in the files, which looks a lot like the unused No Yoshi sign. Early Super Koopa sprites with a smaller, less detailed cape. An early, smaller diagonal pipe, which is far more reminiscent of normal pipes. And the last one I'm going to talk about are these early versions of berries. A variant of the round berry still exists in the final game as a placeholder, but it's overridden with the final animated frames at runtime. There's a couple other things here that I kind of glimpsed over because this is going on for far too long now. So the last thing I'll highlight here is the very large dinosaur-like enemies that were probably early blargs. The non-bone throwing dry bones is pretty interesting too, but other than that, the unused files here are either duplicates, or they're just not really worth discussing. We have one more section to go over in the development chapter, and that would be for all of the background graphics and tile maps. So let's start with the overworld. From the earliest leaked files, Super Mario World originally had plans to have a much different overworld than what it ended up being in the end. These map graphics from April and June of 1989 are the earliest map tiles used for marking levels, land, and Mario's starting position. Very similar to Mario 3. The earliest known versions of the overworld maps themselves were found from multiple data leaks and consist of mock-ups of very early versions of the world. These maps are purely graphical and don't contain any level data, and it appears that Map C was left unfinished by the devs since it's filled to the brim with Mario tiles. Map C looks very similar to Map B in that it was the shape of a mushroom with a winding path that Mario would traverse from the bottom up. There's also a Map A file that isn't shown here, but that one is pretty much identical to map.scr, with the exception being corrupted ocean tiles on the top and bottom of the map. These 4 maps are referred to as the Mode 7 overworld, with Mode 7 being a reference to the SNES background Mode 7, which allowed for stretches and rotations to be performed to one background layer. This means that the devs might have originally intended for the overworld to be zoomed in and out, or perspective to be applied on it, kind of like how it does in The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. Because of Mode 7's limitation to having only one background layer, the overworld panels and paths are on the same layer as the actual terrain itself. The map in the final game uses Mode 1, with most of the terrain on Layer 2, while paths and level tiles are placed on Layer 1. But as for the actual maps themselves, the devs experimented with multiple ways of laying out the pathways. The first version, Map Mode 7, had 2 pathways from the pipe near the bottom left on the main island, with one that seems to have a dead end, and with the other one leading to a pipe up to Bowser's castle at the north of the island. The second map, Map Mode 7B, is almost the same overworld as the first, but this one has more parts of the map being raised, obviously, and a new singular pathway exists around the world. The third map, Map Mode 7A, has the exact same shape as the second, but the obvious difference is that with each numerically defined tile, there is a branching pathway with 3 alphabetically labeled tiles. The fourth and last one, Map ROM.scr, is just a blank version of the last 2. Judging by the file name alone, and the fact that 4 rows of tiles along the bottom match with the bottom 4 rows of tiles in the Mode 7 overworlds, 2 tile maps called Chizu 2 and Map Unit 1 contain overworld data that was made at some point in between the Mode 7 maps. Unfortunately, the graphics aren't included when the files leaked, and any existing map graphics don't really render right. This unassembled reconstruction gives us an idea of what the map might have looked like, and it turns out that this map was simply made to just test the tile set, so... Various early tile maps in the game exist with the general shape of a mushroom. With differing sets of unknown graphics, the file kanoko.scr contains the earliest mushroom-shaped map that there is. Created in July of 1989, it's likely that at least one of the tile maps uses the graphics from the 1989 build of the game. Using the map graphics from a file called xipmaster.cgx as a base, it's possible to rearrange the tiles to complement what the SCR files are expected to find. Most of the tiles are clean matches, but some had to be improvised to fit the SCR layout. Apparently some cliff sides had to be manually mirrored, and other improvisations were the creation of specific grass, cliff, and water tiles. But this is what it looks like. There also appears to be early waterfall animation tiles in a file called vram-kappa-bigblock.cgx. This mockup screen shows what the waterfall probably would have looked like. Included in the aforementioned files are these 3 graphics as well, which include overworld tiles, improvised tiles, and the textures for the waterfall itself. The file mapbg2new.scr expands the mushroom overworld by moving the mushroom island itself to the bottom left and adding an additional island that leads to a larger mainland. This new overworld design was later expanded on with 4 more tile assets with paths and various pieces of decoration. From the various states of completion on these maps, I'm going to guess here and say that the first 2 maps, specifically the second one, was intended to be the original overworld before any levels were completed, and that the map would be completed and ready to go when all of the event tiles were revealed. It might be hard to believe, but mapbg2chica.scr is a variation of the mushroom overworld and is notable for having the word test written at the top of the map. The bottom of the map still being visible makes it clear that this map was placed right on top of the mushroom overworld file, and the name of the file itself suggests that it might have been an early test for Vanilla Dome or another background submap, as chica is Japanese for the word underground. Layer 1 data for the overworld handles information regarding level pathways, tiles, pipes, and some additional decorations. Level tiles from the graphics files called vram-map-kappa-shima.cgx and level path graphics from vram-map.cgx can be combined in order to create a useful tile map to look at old Layer 1 data used for the mushroom map designs. The oldest tile map that there is directly applicable to the very first mushroom overworld, and when it's laid over the 1989 screenshots, it's very clear that it was made for it. 2 more sets of Layer 1 title maps also correspond to the 2 versions of the completed overworld from earlier. This data can actually be overlaid on top of the maps themselves to get additional details about decorations and how Mario would traverse the map. It's worth noting here that at this current time in development, castles did not yet exist in the game, and the castle design graphics were instead used to house graphics for other pieces of Layer 1, like horizontal bridges, tree decorations, cave entrance tiles, and the tower from Super Mario Bros. 3. The last Layer 1 tile map data is actually for the test map. There's actually an interesting connection to the main map here, and is that the cave entrances on the main map appear to overlap exactly with the cave entrances in the test overworld. The test world might have been intended to be an underworld that links up the caves on the map, or it was just a map to test warps that just so happened to line up here. Coincidence? Yeah, probably. The files maptable.scr and mappanel.scr lay out 12 by 12 sections of Layer 2 tiles that are laid out on the map as part of events that trigger upon the completion of a level. These 2 in particular correspond with the older set of Mushroom World graphics which we only know about through the leaks. Also, since I didn't really explain it yet, Layer 2 is used to place the main terrain pieces of the overworld map on, and Layer 3 is used for the overworld border and the status bar. Maptable6.scr lays out larger event tiles for the known graphics variant of the Mushroom Overworld, probably used to give a link in certain places between the overworld in its undetailed state to the version with all of its paths. This file, called xmapbg3, is an outlier of a map file that's meant to bridge the gap between the Mushroom Overworld and the overworld in the finished game. And nobody knows what this is specifically for, so if anybody does, let me know. This map file, which is honestly a mouthful so you can just read it, holds early Layer 1 data for the submap, which is the section of the overworld that contains Yoshi's Island, Valley of Bowser, Vanilla Dome, Special World, Forest of Illusion, and Star World. The only data that exists here is for Yoshi's Island, Valley of Bowser, and Vanilla Dome, and graphics for a locked key entrance and a much larger Bowser's Castle also exist in the title map data, but because of how out of place it is, it's assumed that this file was a test. A similar tile map file contains only Bowser's Castle, and the bottom 4 tiles of Layer 1 data only show 2 paths from Forest of Illusion. The castle in this file uses palette and tile data that still remains in the final game as well. This tile map has 2 copies of the paths in Star World, because obviously, with one in the top left and one in the final position in the bottom right. It's important to note here that the Star Warps don't actually use star tiles, but use regular level tiles just like the normal levels in the stage. The original tiles aren't even the same, with the paths in this version using tiles that enter at a 45-degree angle from the side for some reason, and the path actually breaks if you implement it into the final game, so the devs decided to use a different niche tile for the stage. The files XMap, BG1, and BG1 Chica correspond to the Layer 1 data of the main and submap respectively. There doesn't seem to be any differences with this version and the final version, and the dates for the files come after the game's release in Japan. XMap BG2 Chica, which is the one on screen, corresponds to the Layer 1 data of the maps, and Chica 2 has some of the edges of each world map covered by solid tiles, which is obviously not how it looks in the final game. Map Table 6A and Map Table 2 contain the 12x12 and 2x2 Layer 2 event tiles that correspond to the final version of the game. These next files are some of my personal favorites and are called Map Tables. These 2 files lay out 16x16 Layer 1 tiles, including path tiles, level tiles, warp tiles, and other decorative tiles on Layer 1. The graphics included in the files include collections of graphics, like for example the signs that go all the way to 7 in the image on the left. And if you had to ask me which one my favorite was, I don't think I could give you an answer, honestly. So the next portion I'm going to talk about are the status bars and the titles. Various different tile map and graphics files contain layouts for the status bar, map overlay, and title screens that ended up being unused. The oldest file from October of 1989 includes a very early Mario start screen, and there's quite a lot of differences here. First off, the Mario Start text uses the traditional 1x1 font rather than the taller font on the final screen. It also says the current world and level number, and for some reason the text has 2 exclamation points instead of 1. Really the most obvious differences here, aside from the color being changed to black, is that it features the status bar as well as the item box, which is very similar to, you guessed it, Super Mario Bros. 3. This file, which includes Layer 3 background graphics for castle levels, also happens to include 2 older copies of the status bar. This version of the HUD is far more complete than the last one, and this version uses the stylized Mario text, with the time and coin counter having swapped places as well for whatever reason. This tile map, called 2bitmater.scr, shows a version of the status bar that is almost the same as the final, but like with beta screenshots of the game itself, the lives counter is not centered under the player name, the time counter itself is white instead of yellow, and the coins and bonus points counter is 1 tile closer to their respective values than in the final. This early tile map of the title screen features 2 panels that are dated July of 1989. The left panel, which for some reason contains tile map data that when deciphered from a different file shows the boss platform for Iggy and Larry, and the right panel is supposed to be the title graphic when deciphered. Title.scr advances on the previous one using 4 panels. The first 2 panels are basically the same, but this time the second one properly uses the graphics for the title screen. The third panel, based on its pattern, shows that it's actually the zoom out of the Mushroom Island from a 1989 build screenshot of the game, and it's worth noting that there's actually no graphic for this in the leak, which means that someone had to manually reconstruct it, so shout out to whoever did it. Title new.scr improves on the last one yet again, with this one using the finalized color scheme, as well as having the copyright symbol now having its own distinct palette from the other text. 2-bit tile new is very close to the final game, but the trademark symbol still isn't fixed. Also, for some reason the selection cursor is green in the middle 2 screens because the devs felt like it, I don't know. 2-bit tile new NES is the United States version of the title frames, and these ones have even more unused information than in the others. So firstly, In the second and fourth images, you can clearly see text that says Super Mario Bros. 4. Interesting. The second set uses the Japanese version of the logo but the American trademark symbol. The third set has the Japanese logo but a weird thin trademark logo. And the fourth one seems to be some kind of zone select screen. These tile maps, found in the file 2-bit map back, shows 4 different situations that the player might encounter. The status bar on the top is consistent with the early 1989 builds, and since I can't read Japanese, I'm not really too sure what the second and last ones say. It's worth noting here that the layout of the Lives transfer screen is different to that of the final game, and in the final version, the life counter is displayed next to where the sprite for Mario and Luigi are, with their names displayed right below the sprites. The last image also appears to be a file deletion menu that would have been accessible from the overworld. This updated set of menus, being updated 4 months later by the way, looks much closer to the final. The file select screen is apparently no longer present from the overworld, and the first panel now shows everything but the sprites for Mario and Luigi. The save prompt in the second image is now down to 2 options instead of 3, and the third panel now has the continue and quit buttons from the game over screen. 2-bit map NES is the international translation versions of the panels we just looked at, but for some reason some of them have the old status bar. Also, notice how the second panel says continue with no save. This is more or less meant to say continue without save, but that's a very minor gripe to the translations. Alright, moving on to foreground tile sets. Yanesaka, which roughly translates to roof slope, is one of the first tile maps which is dated October 1989, and this is the first tile map devoted to an actual foreground theme. It looks really similar to the current mushroom platform tile set, but this version is orange and is actually very different in the design of the platform and backgrounds themselves. This one, Chica-back.scr, lays out a couple of underground pieces. Not really anything super special in this one. This one lays out various sizes for the crates in the sunken ghost ship, the launcher for the torpedoes, and the foreground seaweed object that goes unused in the final game. This tile map is responsible for laying out tiles used in the mushroom tile set, including stacked mushroom platforms, the moving rope conveyor belts, and various line guide configs. This one lays out the tiles for the large plants seen in levels like Vanilla Dome 4 and Groovy. Also, for some reason the example plant in this image uses an incorrect dark yellow palette instead of the obvious yellow that it's meant to be. This tile map lays out the graphics for the tapestry seen in door 3 of Bowser's Castle. There's not really that much relation though between this layout and the one in the final game. I'm gonna go pretty fast on these next couple ones, so I hope you're paying attention. The Naname Dokkan unit file contains 16 by 16 tiles and puts them together to create the diagonal pipe that I've already mentioned, as well as the old bush textures with other decorations and 2 layouts. The large and small bushes using the graphics set in the final game, the graphics for the layer 2 crusher objects, more 16 by 16 background tiles, as well as foreground bushes and other multi-block decoration. This file, which is literally 2 objects. This map shows foreground blocks and components, such as brick blocks, note blocks, midway points, and gold tapes. This tile map lays out the individual tiles for the underground asset, with sample slopes and other platforms displayed on the right. There's also this one, and 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 okay, I think you get the idea. So when I was originally going into this video, I knew that there would be a lot of things that ended up going unused in this game, but my god, it's so much more than I thought. From all the individual tile maps, backgrounds, graphics, and whatever else, this video would literally be an hour longer if I didn't just quickly sum up the rest of these. The sheets that I'm going to scroll past right now are still interesting in their own right, but there's like 1,000 of them. And aside from the cutscene graphics for things like the background scenes for the opening cutscenes, the scenes for the last Bowser fight, and baseball graphics, everything else in this section is just really dull on camera if I covered the rest, so we're gonna move on. I know this is gonna disappoint somebody out there, but there's 1,000 of these tile maps. I promise that the rest of the sections talked about here are gonna be far shorter than this one, so time to move on to stuff from the prototype build of the game. In December of 2022, a US localization prototype for Super Mario World was leaked online by somebody named Forest of Illusion. The source card is dated October 25th, 1990, which is 10 months before the US release, and about a month before the game's release in Japan. The prototype looks to be a slightly earlier copy of the version shown in TV commercials in 1991, since it features the same font and debug functionality, but lacks the Super Mario Bros. 4 subtitle screen which is visible in the commercials. Really, the first big difference comes down to the font. The prototype for some reason had a much thinner font than in the release. The lowercase letters use this thin early font, while the uppercase letters use a variant of the classic thick Atari font. The graphics also contain only really one large difference, which is just that these mailbox signs at Yoshi's house didn't have shading on the sign in the prototype. There's also some other small things that the prototype hadn't finalized up to this point, but I thought I'd cover at least these. The title screen is identical to the Japanese version, except for the translated file select text, which matches the final US version. They also for some reason had the unique star graphic for 96 goals in the prototype, but not in the Japanese versions for reasons I could only imagine. Compared to the final version, Nintendo decided to change the shading on the logo at some point. And I didn't realize this until I was editing this part in the video, but the prototype logo has lowercase o's for some reason. At least it was fixed. Believe it or not, but there's actually even changes to the credits. In the prototype, the Boo Buddies and Big Boo are referred to as Boo Diddley and Boo Jackson, with the names being references to musician Bo Diddley and baseball/football player Bo Jackson. And why it was removed, I have no idea. I'm sure someone can explain it in the comments, because there has to be a reason. The prototype's debugging features are similar to that of Super Mario 64's, and we'll start with the most basic. Pressing select on the overworld map will let Mario choose a colored Yoshi from yellow, blue, red, and green. Mario also doesn't die when the timer hits 0. Pausing in a level and pressing select will instantly beat the level and unlock the path, and holding B and pressing select activates the secret exit if it's applicable. Mario can also walk to any stage on the overworld without completing any levels. This feature specifically was also shown off in the commercials that I talked about earlier. Holding L and A and then flying with the cape will let you fly instantly for as long as you want. Pressing it again will then let Mario move anywhere, and I mean anywhere. Holding Y will also speed up your movement. Holding up in a stage and pressing select will cycle through Mario's power-ups, more specifically Small, Big, Cape, and Fire. And after watching a castle destruction scene, you can actually replay the scene by pressing L plus R, or pressing up, L, and R to view the scene for the next castles. But what happens if you go to Star Road early? The answer is that it works, but all of the levels are broken entirely. Well, by broken I mean it actually takes you to the test levels for some reason, and it also takes you to the following levels. Star Road 1 takes you to a duplicative Donut Plains one, so that's cool. Level 2 takes you to a vertical slope test stage. Level 3 takes you to a level where Mario dies instantly. Levels 4 and 5 take you to this test level, which is pretty cool looking if I'm honest. And finally, the special world will take you to the same test stage. But before it does, it plays an intro that has a No Yoshi sign on it. The last thing in the prototype section are these two textures, which contain leftover Japanese text that was eventually overridden by the Super Mario Bros. 4 text, which also didn't get used. Also worth noting here that certain tiles are covered by X tiles, and that these graphics are most likely from The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, as there's a similar file found in the GigaLeak that I looked everywhere for but couldn't find, so just take my word for it. So now we're on to the pre-release stuff. This game had a very interesting development, starting out in 1988 with a very different overworld and closer connections to Super Mario Bros. 3. And fun fact about that, the game was actually built off of a port of Super Mario Bros. 3 that was created to test the Super Famicom's hardware, so it makes a lot of sense now that a lot of the early things derived from Super Mario Bros. 3. At least 2 early builds of Super Mario World were shown on July 28, 1989. The photos were taken off of a projector screen and were published in 1989 issues of Famitsu and Famimanga. It's almost certain that the 1989 Shoshinkai for this game was a private event, open only to members of the press, but what we do have is very nice. Aside from the obvious change in the colors, the logo is pretty much the exact same as the final Japanese version, as is with the wooden border, though the final one is 1 block shorter, and behind the logo is a brown map style drawing of the Mushroom Island. Also talked about earlier, the overworld is vastly different from the final. On the top side of the border is a small Mario walking, and the lives, stage number, counter, and coin counter is very similar to the previous Mario title. I went over a lot of this pretty extensively earlier, so I won't repeat myself with the details, but this version of the game has 4 worlds, that at least 3 of which have a fortress at the end. The domed mushroom house is clearly a starting point, and interestingly, the prologue cutscene of Super Mario Advance 2 ends with a shot of the original world as it fades over the in-game one, which is a brown map style drawing of it, not too dissimilar from the very early worlds for Mario World. The backgrounds of the outdoor levels are also similar to the ones used in the finished version, with the only exception being the circular donut clouds. We can only assume things about it, but judging by their position in between shots, they were probably there as a separate background layer that scrolled by itself in the background. The HUD is also very similar, but for some reason the only thing that's missing is the bonus star counter. The other differences are things like how the lives counter isn't centered with the Mario text, the coin counter is in the place of where the bonus star counter is, and the reserve box color is also teal in only some of the screenshots. These early screenshots also feature many of the things I talked about earlier, like the original coins, as well as those early mushroom platforms. The Super Leaf from Mario 3 also makes an appearance in these, as does Raccoon Mario. The rest of the differences here I've already talked about earlier, and you can probably tell just by looking at the image. This one seems to be an early version of the level Mondo, and aside from Mario 3 textures, the Koopa is walking underwater, the larger floating platform is unused, and the sprite buoyancy was implemented by this point, but I guess it just didn't feel like working or something. Honestly, the rest of the level screenshots all have pretty obvious changes in texture and general layout, and while I think that they're all pretty cool, there's honestly nothing else here that I haven't really already shown yet, so really for the sake of moving on to the next segment, I'll just show all of them in quick succession. Moving on to the other scans. The 82nd issue of Famitsu on September 1st, 1989 also has some scans of the game, but most of it's just everything I've already shown, but I thought I would show it anyway because why not? This screenshot from an interview with some developers from September 2017 features an early design for Yoshi, which also included some other enemies too. The original sprite sheet for this was also found 3 years later in the GigaLeak, with this being the file name. And like with almost all Nintendo games, there is, of course, early footage of this game from Space World of 1990. The 2 builds that we have are a video of a near-final playable demo, and it actually shows quite a lot, which includes a different title screen, Donut Plains 1, Yoshi's house, the Ghost House, and a couple of other stages. The beta footage is actually really helpful for showing even more older versions of the map, starting with the map in full. Really the only things I notice are that the edges for the islands are different, there's less grass, and that it honestly looks like some kind of creepypasta. Even earlier versions look more like drawings than they do a game, and this one follows the same tropes as the first image. Nintendo did eventually add things like the sign next to the castle, but other than that, time to move on to levels again. The early version of Yoshi's Island 1 is almost surreal to me. With the sky being yellow, the bullet bill not having a mouth, and the general graininess of the image, it almost looks like more of a ROM than it does an actual image of the game. This image is from a little later in development, but is much more clear and less grainy. HUD changes aside, I can't get over how the bullet bill looks. I just can't. Just look at it, I love it. This version is nearly complete, and now the differences are getting minuscule. I'll let you see if you can figure it out. I'll wait. Okay, well if you haven't found it by now, for some reason the trail of cloud blocks was eventually moved over by 1 block to the right. Because the devs felt like it, I guess. Can you guess the change in this one? Well, that Galumba was originally in Yoshi's Island 2, and now he's not. Okay, this one is actually pretty cool. This image shows a random underground area, which I'm guessing is an early version of Yoshi's Island 2, and obviously the shell is where the grab blocks are now. But look at the top of the pre-release one. I don't know what that is, but it's pretty cool looking. Whatever that black stuff is in the Yoshi's Island 3 one is cool too, and I have no idea what it is. So if anybody knows why that's like that, let me know. Yoshi's Island 4 also has a couple of changes. The empty block trail is 4 tiles lower to the ground, the coin trail is 1 tile further away from the mushroom platform, and there wasn't even a pipe yet. Just like in the beta footage from 1990, Donut Plains 1 uses a different background palette, and in this one specifically, Mario's cape is also different. The early version of Chocolate Island 2 used far more regular palettes for the foreground and background rather than the brown mountain tiles used in the final, and the Dino Rhinos and Dino Torches are also different, with the pre-release version being a different angle of the sprite. There's also this early version of the sunken ghost ship, and it's pretty much the exact same except for the wooden box on the right being shorter in the final. The last section for the pre-release version are 6 different versions of the title screen. There's nothing that I haven't shown already on the title screens, but my personal favorite one is the GigaLeak version with the Mario 4 logo, just because I've never seen a version that says that until I started making this video. Also, the actual sprite for the Mario 4 logo can be found in the graphics data of the game's non-Japanese releases only. The last and final thing in the pre-release is the change in the font that I had briefly mentioned earlier in the video. Many of the letters are completely different, and since I did already show this earlier, it's finally time to move on to the final game's unused content. Well, we've finally made it to the final version of the game. This section will go over everything that still exists in the game files, and to start, let's go over the sprite-based things. The sprite IDs 1A, 5E, 7E, and 7F contain sprites for the classic piranha plant, this platform, a flying red coin, and a flying mushroom. The classic piranha's vine tile got replaced in the memory with a frame of the Cheep Cheeps, and for some reason the enemy is red instead of yellow like it usually is. The floating platform is a platform, and the 2 flying items are just simply unused like with the rest. Also, in case you were wondering, the red coin gives 5 coins, so there's that. Sprite ID 88 lets you put this weird looking flying cage in the game, and Mario gets automatically placed inside of the cage when the level starts. And if used in conjunction with an auto-scroller, the cage will move across the level on a set path. I'll show you the fixed version of the cage later on. The sprite ID E4 spawns a bunch of bats at whatever Y position it's placed, which acts a lot like the boost spawner in the ghost houses. You also for some reason can't kill the bats at all, and if you try to jump on them, it ends up damaging you. Another weird thing about this one is that the bats spawned by the object have a completely different palette than the ones in-game, being blue and red instead of the normal green and orange. Object IDs 16, 17, 10, 37, and 38 contain a blue coin, a rope, a magenta block, a small door, and a question mark block with a shell. The blue coin acts just like a normal coin, but it's blue! And I know I said this earlier, but the first Mario game to have blue coins that you collect was Super Mario 64. The other things are honestly not that crazy, but I thought I'd include it anyway because why not? The last objects I'll talk about are objects 3F, 36, 37, and 3E. The first one is bush number 5 in the object set for the bushes, which is just not used. The conveyor ropes are completely functional and use special animated rope tiles. They can go left or right, and the diagonal ones can face either direction. Why these are unused I don't know, and I'm also not sure why the log objects aren't used either. Alright, on to sprites. So for the sprites we'll start with this Lakitu. And aside from the variant enemies of him that you do see in the game, this one was probably meant to appear in levels that had them, but just didn't. Remember this cage? Well, this is what it looks like when the texture is fixed. So it turns out that the bird enemy called the Blue Jay was apparently going to carry the cage object around, and it would also follow Mario around on the overworld map when reactivated by changing this address in the code. These next 2 things were meant to go in the overworld map, but either never did or were scrapped at some point in the development. The piranha plant was meant to be decoration, but the Koopaling though, that had a much different purpose. The Koopalings are actually present on the overworld map, but are never visible due to a path change that made them impossible to show up in the game. This is the only overworld sprite to have a purpose other than decoration, and it was originally meant to drag you into levels by doing this whenever you crossed paths with their tiles. So the rest of the graphics are generally uncategorized, and we're going to start with these 3 things. The first thing is an old version of the P-switch, the second is an animated star tile meant for the ghost house, and the third is an early version of the Yoshi berry. These ones are definitely interesting. The one of Mario flying without the cape is very weird looking, and it reminds me of the meme of that guy flying. The Dino ones are interesting too, and the Dino Rhino was supposed to have an actual attack. The one that's in game just walks around back and forth, but this one was actually going to open his mouth and try to attack the player. Also, the fireball right beside it is unfortunately not related to the sprite, as it's just in the same tile set for some reason. The other guy, which is one of the transformed kings from the Mario 3 from Super Mario All-Stars, uses a scaled-down, differently colored variant with a crown. This dust was supposed to appear whenever Mario got on a Yoshi, but I guess they thought it was messy since they made it go unused. However, it is possible to re-enable it by using this code with the Game Genie. These placeholder graphics for the on, off, and spinning blocks are loaded before the animated versions are in the game. The Japanese in the before texture means block transfer, and I'm not really sure why they load it in anyway, but to each his own, I guess. The other thing is obviously early graphics for the bricks. The old one is kind of poorly shaded compared to the finished one, but I could still see applications for both. The birds that are found on Yoshi's house have 2 unused flying frames. These are still unused in Mario World, but interestingly they ended up being repurposed in the Game Boy Advance remake during this cutscene. And for the last 2 unused graphics, we have a texture for a 5-up bonus that I talked about way earlier in the video, and the last thing is... and. It's just and. Alright, so all we have left now are the unused levels. I very briefly mentioned a couple of them already, but there's around 10 more of them that I think are worth mentioning before we finally finish. The first series of levels are the intros to the levels themselves. There's 3 unused level intros in the game, and all of them feature the No Yoshi sign from earlier. All 3 of the intros are also the exact same except for the backgrounds. The first actual level, though, is referred to as Morton's Plains, and it references the same level data of Donut Plains 1, but it has a glitched background with the level names being blank in the Japanese version. The background tile map is the same one seen in several other stages, but this one has the wrong graphics and palette applied. The test level has many different level IDs, and they all consist of this level that has the words test on it. The last known use of this level seems to have been to test the secret 1-up points, which is what those numbered mushrooms are, to make sure that they work when you get them in the respective order. The vertical slope test was mentioned earlier in the video in palette form, but this is what the actual level looks like. It's just a vertical level that contains 8 slope objects, and the slopes are specifically designed to work with the memory maps that are used in vertical levels. It's also possible to fix the broken background by changing the tile set to Underground 3. This level, being called Ride Among the Clouds, is the first level in the ROM aside from the test level, which makes this one of the earliest levels ever created for the game. It's obviously notable for being an early level, but it's also the only level that uses this floating platform in the entire game, so that's cool. Also, the pipe at the end unfortunately doesn't go anywhere. This level, called Mushroom Scales, is so far the only level I know of that actually uses the classic piranha plants. The level's sprites also indicate that the platforms might have been intentionally programmed to move around, but there's honestly no telling since this is the only information that we have. Now at first glance, you might think this is probably a level that teleports you to level stages, but it's actually meant to teleport to the bosses. The level is called the Boss Test, and the doors specifically lead to Bowser, Morton, Roy, Ludwig, Iggy, Larry, Reznor, Lemmy, and Wendy. It's speculated that the ordering might have been the order that the bosses were programmed in, but again, there's no telling. And for the people who really want to know, the 2 question blocks contain a cape feather and a fire flower. This one is one of my favorites. It's called the Lava Cave, and it's as complete as Ride Among the Clouds is, but it's still missing some things like a goal sub-level for the alt path. This level also uses Lava Object 1A, when the final game uses Object 3A for underground levels, and it's because the sloped lava tiles would overwrite the generic lava tiles before they changed them. This small test level is appropriately named Twin Blocks, and the blocks have 2 hotheads and 2 sparkies. There's not much more to this one. It was definitely used to make sure they follow the walls. The image on the top is an early version of Wendy's Castle. This is the only version of a level found in the final game, and it's almost identical to the finished one, but there are some things that they changed. The original was more difficult due to the changes, but the weirdest thing is that in the older version, the door at the end just doesn't exist. They probably just didn't add it yet. I really don't need to show this one because it's easily the most boring, but I'll show it anyway since we're almost done. This level is nothing more than just 8 screens of nothing with a pipe, and if you had to guess what this was called, what do you think? Well, if you guessed pipe and ground, then congratulations. The last 2 things are for the Ghost House exit and its cloudy version. And like with the other Ghost House exits, this one is probably meant to use an empty layer 2 as its background, but it just doesn't. The specified data here only contains a goal bar, and it might have belonged to the next ghost house exit, or maybe a completely different level. Also, the cloudy version has, well, clouds, and 3 bushes on layer 2. And that is all of the unused content. Well, we've made it to the end. So when I originally started writing the script for this video, I thought it would contain far less stuff, but I was wrong. I really hope you guys enjoyed this one because I spent pretty much like 2 months on it, and of the one other video I've made on unused content so far, this is a really good addition to the series. If you guys have any other games that you think I should do a deep dive on, I'd love to hear your suggestions in the comments, because I have a lot of fun making these videos, and I might expand my content even more in the future, but I have a lot on my plate right now, so we'll see. Alright, well I gotta go. Binding of Isaac multiplayer will hopefully be out by the time I upload this, and so I'll be pretty busy with that, so... And as always guys, I hope you learned something new, and as always, thanks for watching.